Ruby on Rails has been worked on the most by its creator, David Heinemeier Hansson. The next most frequent contributor to Rails is Aaron Patterson, our guest on today's episode of Software Engineering Daily. He's better known online as Tenderlove. Topics discussed in today's episode include Ruby relative to JavaScript, Rails relative to Linux, and DHH relative to Tenderlove. But before we get to my conversation with Aaron, a quick word from a sponsor who helps keep Software Engineering Daily on the rails. Search is the best way to navigate websites and mobile applications. If you don't have a good search experience, your users will look somewhere else. Luckily, there's Algolia. Algolia is a search as a service that delivers fast, intuitive search with an easily integrated API. Developers love Algolia because it is an out-of-the-box search solution with APIs for all the platforms you could need: Rails, Node.js, PHP, Java, and more. Product Hunt, Hacker News, and Periscope all use Algolia to power the crazy fast search on their websites and mobile apps. Last month, applications using Algolia processed over 11 billion search queries, making it one of the most reliable search technologies currently available on the market. Give your users the power to find what they want quickly and easily with Algolia. To try it out and get 2 months of Algolia for free, visit algolia.com/sedaily. Now let's get back to this episode. Aaron Patterson is a Ruby and Ruby on Rails core committer and works at Red Hat. Aaron, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Oh, thank you.
You have more commits to Ruby on Rails than anyone except the creator of Rails, David Heinemeier Hansson. And I'd like to start off by talking about your contributions. What is it about Ruby on Rails that motivates you to put so much work into the project?
Well, I guess there's a few. Well, I'll tell you my main reason. Essentially, I fell in love with Ruby, the programming language, and I got a job doing Ruby on Rails, right? So I got a Rails position, and I was just super grateful that I had this framework that I could actually use to, program Ruby as my day job. Like, I was a Ruby programmer for, I don't know, maybe a year or two before I ever got a job doing it, and Rails was the way I could actually work with Ruby. So I wanted to do everything I could to, make sure that everybody else could do Ruby programming as well. So that's really what motivated me to get started working on Rails internals.
Okay. So when you first got involved, what kind of development work were you doing at the time?
At the time, I was just working at a startup. We just had a Rails application. It was actually in online advertising, and I don't know. Basically, we would just run into a bug here or there, and I would try to fix that bug and send patches and stuff. Though a while back, I looked at the very first patch that I sent, and it got rejected.
Do you remember what it was for?
It was just, I don't remember exactly, but it was just it was for a bug, but somebody had actually already fixed the bug, and I just didn't see it. This was back when Rails was still using Subversion, so I guess I just hadn't updated yet.
Okay, that's funny. So, what were the projects when you started working on or thinking more about Rails? Were there some personal Rails projects that you were working on?
Mostly for work. I wrote a blog with Rails, and I'd write, I don't know, a few apps here or there, but they were mostly just for play. It wasn't anything serious. I've really done most of my serious Rails development at work mostly.
Yeah. Did Rails contrast to frameworks you had used previously?
Oh yeah. So before I was a Rails programmer, I was a Java programmer doing J2EE development. And I mean, it was just using Rails was just a breath of fresh air. I mean, there are so many problems with the J2EE frameworks that we were using at work. I mean, the first problem was we actually had to pay for this framework, so that meant it was impossible for me to do any programming on it at home in my free time, right? The other thing is all the XML configuration files that we had to do, just setting it up was a huge setting this framework up was such a huge pain that once I could get Rails up and running, I was hooked. Actually, at that job I got it hooked up and using an Oracle database. Then it was a little bit more difficult than everybody else's setup, but I could actually get it going without writing tons of XML, so I was really happy.
Do you think that people felt the same way when they first started using the Java frameworks like Spring?
Honestly, I have no idea. Before I was a J2EE person, I was a Perl person. I did a lot of Perl programming, and it was all website app development with Perl, and a lot of the stuff that we have in Rails, I already had that in the Perl frameworks that we were using. So it was actually really painful for me to go from Perl to J2EE. I didn't like it. The main reason I did it is because back then it was I think around 2001, and the first tech bubble was crashing, and essentially my manager at work said, okay, you're going to need to learn how to do Java or find a new job. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll learn how to do Java. So, it wasn't, for me, going to J2EE was really terrible, but I don't know about the rest of the developer community at large. You know? Actually, I come to think about it, this was when I was doing J2EE stuff. It was before Spring was around, and we actually started using Spring. I remember towards the end of right before I quit that job, we started using Spring, and it was actually a lot easier than the stuff we were using before. We were using a thing called ATG Dynamo, which probably people listening will have no idea what it is.
Yeah, I've never heard of that. So, zooming out, what impact has Rails had on the world of software development?
I think Rails has had a few different impacts. One is, off the top of my head, one is making it easier for people to get into doing web development, which I think is really, really good. Today, when I was doing J2EE stuff, you had to have a lot of experience doing programming already before you could start doing web application building. You had to already know a bunch of stuff about programming, whereas today, especially with the start of Rails, you didn't need to know nearly as much to get a website, an actual dynamic website up and running. And I think that's actually really good. It's basically made it such that the developers now demand that a framework be easy, right?
Yeah.
It's essentially a requirement these days. You have to be able to do that, and if you don't do that, then nobody will use your framework. And I think that's good. I think it's a very, very good way to push the market forward, the market for web frameworks, essentially.
It's funny because I think in the past, perhaps the inverse was true, where if a framework was highly complicated and you had to do a ton of configuration up front, it was almost seen as laudable. And it's okay, yeah, you've got to go through this trial by fire of reading the manual and reading all the documentation before you are even equipped to write a Hello World application.
Yeah, that's how you know it's scalable, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So one of the things I find interesting, and you can tell me if this is an incorrect contrast, but it seems like, between you and DHH, he is working on Rails for the sake of getting a better framework to build his product Basecamp. But you are more concerned with kind of Rails for the sake of Rails. Would you say that's an accurate comparison?
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I think that's true, or probably true for the most part. I mean, I definitely work on Rails for our applications at work. Like we have, when we run into issues or there's some particular thing we need to change about the framework, then I'll go ahead and do that. But I'd have to say, yeah, the main thing that keeps me motivated, especially over time, is making sure that I can continue to work in Ruby for my day job and also make it so that other people can continue to work in Ruby for their day job. I think I'm haunted by my past of being forced to use Java.
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking of different frameworks, how do you feel about the full stack JavaScript frameworks that have been growing in popularity?
How do I feel about them?
Well, yeah, in terms of, do you see any, as a framework builder yourself, are there things that you see as laudable about them that you like to import into the Rails framework, or are there warts within them that you think Rails does better?
Well, it's hard to say. There's some stuff that I see in Node that I'd like to steal. I mean, whenever I see interesting things about other frameworks, I will think about how we could incorporate those into Rails. I mean, one of them, for example, like Node is very IO oriented, and I think that's a good thing that we should steal. But I don't know. I don't like JavaScript.
Why not?
It's just, well, mainly, okay, one thing I don't like about it, which is very, I guess it's really superficial, is that I think the literal keyword function is too long. It really annoys me. Like whenever you need to do an unnamed, like a lambda, essentially, you got to write out function.
Yeah.
That I don't like that. Like the way that Ruby does block passing and lambdas in Ruby, I think is superior to the way JavaScript does them. The other thing is that I don't like the way I actually think this is getting fixed in ES6, but the way that self is handled, essentially. So you'll see a common pattern in JavaScript is people will be like, var self equals this, and then reference that self inside of an unnamed block because it's not saving the this context that you want, where Ruby's self is the one that you do want. But on the other hand, there's some things that I would like to steal from JavaScript too. For example, though I don't know how we'd actually do this in Ruby, how we'd actually steal it, is one thing I like about JavaScript is when you say like object.method name, that doesn't actually call the method. It gives you the essentially the function back, right? You have to add parentheses to the end of it to actually call that method. And I think that's a really cool and strong feature that JavaScript has that Ruby doesn't. And the reason Ruby doesn't have it is because we can call, if we say foo.bar, that actually calls the method. You can call the method without parentheses, right?
Yeah.
The reason I like that in JavaScript is you can do a lot of interesting functional patterns with that. So you could say like, okay, I want a map and I want the maps block to be some, this object's function. So you can do that with JavaScript, and you can't do that with Ruby. And I think that's really cool. So that's one feature of JavaScript I really like.
So one of the things that comes up when I talk to people about Rails versus full stack JavaScript is the trade-offs between having a multi-language paradigm versus having a single language paradigm. do you see it as inherently valuable to have a framework where there's multiple languages for multiple contexts of your application?
I don't know if it's inherently valuable or not. I guess I know a lot of people complain that they have to do like, they don't like doing context switches between languages. But I mean, honestly, it doesn't really bother me. But it may just be that I've been programming for so long that I just don't care anymore. I just go to one language. I'm like, okay, I can figure this out. It's fine. So it doesn't, having that context switch really doesn't bother me at all. So, I mean, I don't know. For some people, it's probably good for some people who, maybe they only really know one language really well. So it would be beneficial to them if everything is in the same language. They could get more work done. I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's all I care about is how people can be more effective at their jobs, right?
Yeah, and, in some sense, I feel like even if you're using JavaScript end-to-end, you are doing some polyglot development, some multi-language stuff, because JavaScript, raw JavaScript looks very different from React.
Server-side.
Well, yeah. Server-side or React.js code, which is, people talk about that like it's JavaScript, but it kind of looks different. So I don't know, it's I think it's like you're polyglot if you do, polyglot if you don't.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you don't have to, for example, like when you're writing client-side JavaScript, you don't need to worry about, say the number of open file descriptors you have, right? That's not a thing. But you do need to know that when you're on the server side. And on the flip side of that, like on the server side, you may not be worrying about, especially if you're doing systems programming, you're probably not worrying about the DOM so much, right? You have to think about these. You still have to switch contexts. You have to know, hey, I'm writing this, I'm doing something with the client, I'm doing something with the browser here, versus I'm doing something on Unix. I need to know about, these particular things. So I don't know. I mean, yes, in both cases, you'd be using the same language, but you still need to be able to separate that knowledge, right? Just because you know how to write JavaScript for the client side does not mean that you know how to write JavaScript for the server side.
So I want to talk about open source. Had you contributed to any open source software before you got into Rails?
Yeah, I did a little bit of Perl open source stuff, but not very much. Like my very first open source contribution was in like 2001, and it was to a Perl module. And then once I switched over to Java, I really didn't do so much open source stuff. I'd say like my open source career really started with Ruby and Rails.
How does working on open source compare to the work that you do in proprietary systems, or the work that you have done? I guess most of the work that you do these days is open source. Yeah.
I work at Red Hat now, and all of our products are like everything is open source.
Right.
So everything I do is open source. But when I was working on proprietary web applications, I don't know. I mean, I try to treat them the same way, but the reality is, like, when you're working on a proprietary side, I think you can be, especially if it's a proprietary website, like the backend code is proprietary, you can be a bit more fast and loose with what you're doing. Like, for example, when you're developing a web app, you don't care about semver on your web app, right? Like that's not a thing. You're like, okay, I'm just gonna add this new feature and fix a bug and push it out to production, and I'm done. You don't need to worry about it. And I think that's because your proprietary web app doesn't have any downstream customers necessarily. That's a little bit different if you're developing proprietary API code. But
what about in terms of how it makes you feel? You seem very emotionally rewarded by working on open source software. Yeah, I do prefer to work on
open source software for sure. Like, I don't want to work. I really don't want to work on proprietary stuff anymore. But I don't know that it's. I wouldn't necessarily say it's an ideological thing. It's just because I like working with varied people. I mean, before I'd gotten into open source, everybody that I had ever worked with was local. I mean, like, I go to the office, meet these people, and have coworkers. And that was that. But when I got into the world of open source, it's like I got to meet and work with all these people from all over the world, and that was really fun and rewarding for me. It opened up a new world of software development to me. So that's why I enjoy doing it.
So I totally understand that. When you talk to other people who have worked on large open source projects, like Linux, for example, do you get the sense that the Rails open source community has unique qualities that separate it from those other large open source projects?
I don't know. I mean, we do have, I think every open source project is a bit different. I particularly enjoy the Rails community because I think we're pretty easy to work with, relatively speaking. Other open source projects are not so easy to work with. And I think that's one thing that I like about the Rails community and our project is like we do our best to work well with the community. So, if we can't, we help people onboard, we help, we try to give good feedback. And I think we actively do that. It's important to us on the core team. I don't know if that's true for, some other it's hard to say because I've never been a member of, like the Linux kernel or whatever. You know what I mean? Like every open source project I'm a member of is part of the Ruby community. And I think the Ruby community at large is mostly easier to work with than other communities, but I don't have any data to back that up,
Well, organizations tend to follow in terms of how their leaders operate. And if you compare Mott's to how Linus acts, or at least how Linus is perceived by the community. Maybe he's a much warmer and fuzzier character in person, but certainly my understanding of him and how he's perceived in media and YouTube videos and blog posts that he writes is like really, really harsh.
I've read those emails. Yep.
It's like really harsh, but clearly very effective. So how does that compare to how Ruby on Rails is led? You're essentially a leader of Ruby on Rails, through action, by being the second most frequent committer.
I think, probably clearly the way that Linus runs stuff is effective. He seems to be getting stuff done, but at the same time, like, it may not necessarily be fun to be there, Like, I have a really fun time. Like, I have a really fun time programming. I have a really fun time being in open source, and I want other people in the community to feel the same way as well. Programming isn't just my job, it's also my hobby. And I feel like a lot of people who are contributing to Rails, or contributing to open source, it's true for them as well. They're probably, most people are probably doing it during their free time. So, it seems like if you're not nice to them, it seems like you're disrespecting their free time. That might sound a little bit harsh, but maybe you're not. They could be having a better time. You know what I mean? Like, why should they be contributing to your open source project rather than, like, I don't know, going out and flying a kite or something? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So what are the big challenges of, I guess I don't know how much delegation you do, but in terms of being in charge of a large percentage of, or maybe it's not even in charge. I'm just curious how the delegation and the governance works in such a large and important open source project.
For Rails, this is pretty specific to Rails. For Rails, it's a fairly, I guess, motley crew. We don't have, I mean, typically what will happen is, if there's some feature I want, I will just add it, or I'll ask someone to do it. And the same thing goes with DHH, so his requests are typically, the things that he wants done are typically like broader and, I don't know, more like have a greater impact. Like, for example, even though I have the second, so many commits to Rails, that doesn't mean that I could introduce something like Action Cable, right? I couldn't unilaterally be like, okay, boom, there we go, new thing. Whereas that's something that DHH can do, and he can because it's his project. So it's fine. Stuff that I do would be like, when I put together projects, sometimes I'll do them, sometimes I'll ask other people to do them. But my strategy is essentially to add stuff that's not, I don't know, it's not so showy, I guess. I don't mean showy in a bad way. I mean more, it's just not as, I don't know, not as advertised as much, I guess.
I see.
It'd be like, it's there, and when you discover that feature, that's great. Or maybe it's more extensible in this particular way that we like, so we can build better stuff with it. That's typically the stuff that I target. And the reason I target that type of stuff is because I think Rails as a framework is extremely good and satisfies 80% of everything I need to do. So the stuff that I want to add is, very, incremental, I guess.
Sure. I love being a software engineer because of how easy it is to build side projects. And I've built countless side projects. I've built a social gambling application, a dating website backend that had 0 users, a stock trading music rhythm application for Android. And I think every developer should have side projects. So when I have a web app that I want to deploy and share, I want to show my friends my most recent project that nobody will care about, I use DigitalOcean to quickly spin up a server and host my projects. And who knows, if one day one of my apps takes off and goes viral and people actually do care, I can easily scale using DigitalOcean's flexible pricing plan. Companies like TaskRabbit that have grown rapidly have used DigitalOcean for this very reason. But until this happens, I will happily stick with the $5 a month plan. Sign up with promo code SEDaily to get a free $10 credit as a listener of our show and start building your apps. We would love to see what listeners build, so send us an email showing us your project. I've also interviewed Moisey Uretsky, who is the co-founder of DigitalOcean, and he mentioned that the ease of use and the flexibility is why they built the service in the first place. That DigitalOcean interview is one of my favorite episodes. Moisey talks about bleeding in a data center. He says, you don't know how hard it is to do a cloud hosting service until you've bled in a data center. It's really interesting. So speaking of which, let's get on with this episode of Software Engineering Daily. So you're a core committer to Ruby as well as Rails. How do those two communities compare to one another?
The Ruby core team is a bit, I don't know, they're different for sure. One difference is the Ruby core team, we do, I'd say 90% of our communication via email. So this is just practically speaking, right? We do 90% of our communication via email, where Rails is 90% of our communication via chat. Chat and GitHub, essentially. Also, if I wanted to add something new to Rails, and sometimes I do, I just do it, right? Whereas that's not true with Ruby the language. With Ruby, it's Matt's. He has to say that's the thing I want. So, I mean, typically my responsibilities on the Ruby core team are like bug fixes or maybe optimizations or something like that. Nothing that's or in standard library, like bug fixes in standard library and stuff. As far as the language is concerned, it's Matt's only, which isn't true of the Rails framework. Where the Rails framework is concerned, we're the core team is a bit more or has a bit more responsibilities, right? Or they can make more changes more freely.
How has Ruby evolved since the time you've gotten involved in the project?
How has it evolved? I don't know. I mean, I guess the first version of Ruby I used was probably 1.8.2, I think. And since then, I mean, there's been a ton of stuff, but it's mainly performance stuff, like better garbage collector, a virtual machine, and then, various things like encoding, adding an encoding system, things like that.
Well, what are the challenges to writing code for stuff like that? Like, for example, like I know nothing about a virtual machine or how to write a garbage collector. Did you have to learn how to do that stuff in order to be effective as a Ruby developer?
No, not at all. I think that's one thing I like about, well, when you say Ruby developer, do you mean?
I mean
Ruby
developer of Ruby.
Okay. No, I didn't have to know that stuff before I became a core team member. Mostly Ruby has a lot of stuff a lot of code in the standard library, and not enough people doing bug fixes and stuff on it. So basically that's how I got onto the core team, is I was doing a lot of bug fixes, and they just said, okay, we'll put you onto the core team so you can just commit bug fixes without submitting patches all the time. So I didn't need to know how that stuff worked at all. It's just after, once you start poking around, then you learn that stuff over time. I mean, I've been on the Ruby core team for, I want to say 7 or 8 years now. And I mean, just over time, you start investigating stuff. Like you get a bug, and maybe it's a hard one, and you just keep diving down and down until you find, oh, this is a bug it's actually a bug in the garbage collector. And in order to understand that, you had to understand the garbage collector. So, just that type of stuff over time, you learn it.
Right. So we did an interview with David Heinemeier Hansson recently, as I said to you before this began. And he said that the Ruby language fit his brain better than other languages. And he talked about the trade-offs that Ruby makes in terms of speed and efficiency versus developer productivity. And I'm curious if you feel a similar affinity for the language, and also, well, I mean, obviously you feel some sort of affinity, but if that programmer ergonomics drives your affinity, and also where you've seen as a Ruby developer, as a core Ruby developer, where you've seen that trade-off be made in the development of the language.
Well, so yeah, developer ergonomics are incredibly important to me, and that's one of the reasons that Ruby really clicked with me, and I wanted to stick with it. It's just so easy to use. It's so easy to use, and just when you things aren't unexpected. Like when you do something and you expect something to work, most of the time it does, which isn't true with a lot of other languages. So that's one reason I really liked it. And as far as like speed is concerned, I think that's an interesting question, because I don't necessarily think there are any trade-offs. Like I don't actually think that's true. I think that we can make Ruby as fast as we want it to be. It's just that we have to come up with clever hacks. Like, so for example, one thing is monkey patching, for example. If you monkey patch something, the time that you monkey patch something, it's going to slow your program down. But over time, your program, as the program runs, it actually speeds up, and that didn't matter anymore. Doesn't matter anymore. But you have to come up with those types of hacks to get around that thing. Like if you didn't, if the virtual machine was naive, then that monkey patch would have impacted the speed of the whole program. So, I mean, there's other things like some bits of APIs, like getting bindings on procs, calling evals. Those things are exposed, and using them can slow down your program. But I think a clever implementer, which Koichi is, and a lot of the people on the core team are very clever implementers. I think what they'll do is say, okay, that feature is available, but if you use it, it could possibly slow down your program. Mm-hmm. So I don't necessarily know that it's a trade-off. It's just exposing that feature to you and saying, well, if you use it, it's going to slow you down. But you don't have to use it, right? It's there, but just, if you need a fast program, don't use it.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So you have a lot of contributions to Rails and Ruby that we could discuss, but I want to talk about AdequateRecord because I think it's a product that you take a lot of pride in, and it's a project that you worked on to speed up ActiveRecord by a factor of 2 or more. And in order to talk a little bit about AdequateRecord and these improvements, I would like to start by talking a little bit about ActiveRecord. So for those who don't know, what is ActiveRecord?
So ActiveRecord is an ORM that just wraps your database up and does basically generates SQL queries for you and returns objects from the database. And it's a very, very simple ORM where it just maps class names to table names. And if you look at Martin Fowler wrote a pattern called ActiveRecord, and that's essentially what this is that pattern turned into code.
Okay, and what are the steps that that people need to understand about the ActiveRecord AST generation and translation to SQL query? That what would they need to know to understand how AdequateRecord works?
I mean, at a high level, essentially what ActiveRecord does is, I should probably just, for people who don't know, we should talk about AdequateRecord for a second. AdequateRecord doesn't exist anymore. It's gone.
Oh.
What that was essentially, I made a branch of ActiveRecord, called it AdequateRecord, and then basically merged it back into ActiveRecord. So for all intents and purposes, today ActiveRecord is AdequateRecord. They're the same thing today, just in case people don't know. Because I've actually had that question, like, where is AdequateRecord now? Basically, what ActiveRecord does is the way that it would query the database is it would take, you would write out your code and it would convert that code into a SQL AST, and then it would convert that SQL AST into a string. Then it would send that string to the database and then get your results back and return them to you.
Right, and so AdequateRecord is was a set of patches that you wrote which improves the speed of ActiveRecord by implementing some caching. Can you explain what elements of the ActiveRecord process get cached and how this caching layer speeds things up?
Sure. So before the AdequateRecord patches, essentially this AST would get generated, and in that AST we would have some dynamic values. For example, if you said, find a user with ID 2, it would generate an AST, and that number 2 would actually be in the AST. So it would say select star from users where ID equals 2. That 2 was in the AST, and we would generate a string that had that 2 in it and send it off to the database. Now, the interesting thing is when you say like, okay, user, if you want to find the user with ID 2, typically that number is coming from the request, right? You're saying you're getting that number 2 as input. It's typically dynamic. Now, what's interesting is that most of that query is actually static. The only thing that changes between requests is that number. You'll be saying like, okay, I need to find the user with some ID, and that ID came from the request object. Now, what AdequateRecord did is say, okay, let's separate these dynamic values from these static values. Between requests, that SQL statement, the only thing that ever changed in that SQL statement is the ID. So the idea of AdequateRecord was, okay, let's take that static part and cache it between requests, and only change the ID part of it, that one dynamic part. So since we did that, we're able to essentially skip AST generation between requests.
Right. So are there any costs to this caching?
Yeah, I mean, there's a memory cost. I mean, cache isn't free, right? You have to put that cache somewhere. So we store it in memory, and the size of that cache will change. It's hard to say exactly how much memory it costs because it depends on the SQL statement that you're caching. But yeah, it does cost.
Okay. So, as I read about this in a blog post that you wrote, and the idea is caching the computation for SQL. And this is a type of operation that has come up in some other episodes of Software Engineering Daily. We've talked about frameworks called Spark and Tachyon, which I know you probably haven't any involvement in. You may not know about them, but these projects are very far removed from Rails, and it would be interesting if there are common threads between them. And this concept of caching the computation for an operation is kind of counterintuitive to me, because it seems like it would be cheaper to cache the results of a computation rather than caching the computation itself. So can you talk about this process of caching a computation in broad strokes and what that actually means?
I think you actually put it in better terms than I did. It's actually what you're saying is actually correct. Yes, that we're caching. In this case, the return value is essentially the AST. So we're computing the AST and then just caching that. So we could say that the computation is calculating the AST. The result of that computation is the AST. That is our result, and essentially all we're doing is caching that. That's all that's going on, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's essentially the same thing.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, all right. I guess, yeah, it kind of makes sense. I don't know. I'm still a little confused on the topic, but
yeah, we're just saying you have some function, and that, given some parameter, the output of that function is some value, and we know in this particular case that, if we can separate that ID, pull that ID out, then calculating that AST is always going to have the same result every single time, besides that dynamic value. If it weren't for, you think about it, if it weren't for that dynamic value, then that SQL statement would always be the same. So if we can separate those two, then we calculate that static part of the SQL statement once and cache that return value. So we're caching the results of that SQL statement computation.
Okay. No, I think I understand it. But so you said that working on this code was at times extremely depressing. So could you expound on some of the aspects of developing AdequateRecord that were emotionally draining?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, in order to get those two values separated, the SQL statement and that dynamic value, getting those two bits of information to be separated from each other was very difficult to do, because you'd have, there would be bits of code that would combine the two, and those bits of code would be 30 stack frames deep, right? And you need to figure out how can I get those two to be separated, and then still be able to pass all the tests. So figuring out how to refactor all of that code such that it would be, sustainable not sustainable. Figuring out how to refactor that code, still pass the tests. It was just extremely difficult, like very difficult. You'd fix one test and break a few others, and it was just, not fun at times.
So as a case study in how the sausage is made in these giant open source projects, once you decided you wanted to work on this, how did the integration with and the communication with the community, did that happen incrementally, or did you just eventually say, okay, I've got this done, and then you submit it to the community and then they start to vet it? Or what's the process of getting a big low-level change like that accepted?
Well, since I'm on the core team, I just do it. But no. Basically, what I would do is it's fairly incremental. Like, I would say, okay, here's a place where this code is, like, we need to refactor this particular spot so that we can separate, in this particular case, we want to separate those 2 bits of information. But I do this for pretty much, every feature that I want to add to any project. Is I say, okay, I want to add the feature here, but the code, like right now, the code is very inconvenient. It's really inconvenient for me to add that feature because of the way the code is written. So typically what I'll do is refactor that spot such that it would be more convenient, right? So I refactor it such that it maintains the current behavior. I've essentially changed nothing about the behavior, but it's now more convenient for me to add a new feature. So because I'm doing it that way, it means that I can make changes without breaking the current, existing behavior, and it means that my final diff will be much smaller. So AdequateRecord, when I merged that in, it was actually not, the diff was not very large at all. It was actually a fairly small change. And the reason I was able to get away with a fairly small change is because I had done work for years slowly refactoring to the point where making that particular change would be a smaller diff. So it was essentially breaking it up over time and breaking this thing up over time to the point where I finally had a smaller diff to do this. I had actually been working on that. I don't want to say passively. It wasn't really passively. I could say passively. I was passively working on that project for many years, actually, since maybe Rails 3.1. And all I was doing then is saying, okay, I know of this optimization. I think we should add this optimization. But if you look at the code today, it's very, very inconvenient to add that optimization. So what do I need to do to the framework in order to make it such that I can do that optimization? So I would just make these incremental changes over time. And doing something like that requires a lot of dedication and a lot of time. And to be honest, I don't think I could have, at the time I was working on Rails full-time for AT&T, and I don't think I could have accomplished that project without full-time sponsorship. It was just, it took so long to do it.
Yeah. But those long and draining projects can be the most emotionally rewarding.
Oh yeah, finally merging that thing was yes, we did it. Finally, it's over.
I read about this work on AdequateRecord on your blog, and you're a frequent blogger. Why do you feel that blogging is a good complement to the other work that you do in the Rails community?
Is it? I don't know if it is.
Okay, well, it's certainly a good complement to your personal sanity or psychology.
I like blogging. So I really like teaching people. So it's fun to blog stuff. I have to admit though, sometimes I have a lot of blog posts that are in my head, and I think about, I should blog this or that, and then I'll be like, why bother? And then I don't do it. So I need to figure out a way of blogging that's or I need to figure out a more efficient way of getting what's in my head down on typed out. But I mean, I don't know. I think it's important to blog about stuff because, one reason I like to blog things is because if you get the same question over and over again, it's easier to be like, okay, here's go check this out.
Right.
Read this link. The other is I really enjoy teaching people what I know, or what I've learned. So I like to blog about that stuff just because I hope that somebody will learn something from it. I think the third reason I blog stuff is just so I don't forget.
Right.
Because I know I will forget, and I need to come back. I need to be able to use it as a reference.
So there are new programmers, and some of them are choosing to learn programming with Rails. Some of them are choosing to learn with other mechanisms. Why would you advocate learning Rails as a way to get started for new programmers?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, using Ruby is such an easy programming language, and it's true. Some people, I think there's Ruby developers out here that say this is a bad thing, but there's a lot of Rails programmers out there who learned Ruby through Rails. Like Rails was their very first exposure. They didn't know how to program. They picked up Rails, and you say, what do you program in? And they say, I program in Rails. And you're like, no, you program in Ruby. They don't know that they're programming in Ruby. But I actually think it's a good thing. It says that the Rails framework is so easy that anybody can pick it up, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Rails is so easy that anyone can do it. So that's why I would recommend people use Rails for sure.
Mm. Are there any anti-patterns that you see new developers with Rails consistently partake in?
Oh, anti-patterns. I can't say that I've seen anyone do any one particular anti-pattern consistently. I think maybe one thing is that, it's really hard. It's really hard, and it's something that I don't think you can learn how to do without experience. But I see a lot of people. Sometimes people will send way too many parameters to a function that won't use enough objects. But sometimes I see people using too many objects, things like that. And you can't. It's very difficult for me to say to you this is the right answer, right? I can't really do that. It's a lot more soft topic than that. It requires experience to see that type of stuff. But I mean. I can't say, so that's why it's hard for me to say that there's any one particular anti-pattern that I see. I guess what I would say is, avoid doing if you read about some really cool technique, don't use it. If you're a new programmer, don't wait a while. Just wait a little while. You're not going to get, nothing is going to hurt you by waiting. You'll be fine if you wait a little while. Gain a bit more experience, do some, program for a bit longer. I encourage people, wait like a week, just a week even. But yeah, I don't know. It's tough. It's tough to say. I think as a new programmer, you're every kind of cool technique that you see, it's really tempting to use those. And I'd encourage new programmers to just, wait a little bit. Do some, try to figure it out on your own.
So I'd like to begin to close off with a question about the future. What is the future of Ruby on Rails?
What is the future of Ruby on Rails? I'm trying to think of a pun, and there's nothing coming. I don't know. It's really hard to say. I want Rails' future to be bright, and I think I've already gone over why this is. I love programming in Ruby, and I really want everybody else to be programming in Ruby as well, so that they can. I love it so much, and I want other people to love it as well. So I mean, as long as I'm contributing to Rails, I'm going to work to make Rails' future bright. As far as like what's coming with the web is concerned, like actual technical features, H2 support, which I'm working on. Trying to think of anything else. I mean, the new stuff coming up with, especially WebSocket support. I think it's great stuff that's coming out with Rails 5. So that's really exciting. But yeah, major things are like H2 support, though I hope that nobody notices that we have that.
Why do you say that?
Well, so my ideal, like when I'm adding stuff to Rails, my ideal way of adding things is such that the feature is there, but you don't notice it's there, because typically if you notice it's there, it means that I broke something. So I just want to have the support there, and maybe you upgrade Rails and you don't know it yet, and then you're like, you don't know that it has H2 support, and you're like, I wonder if Rails has H2 support, and you're like, you Google and you're like, it does. I'll just turn that on, and then you do, and everything works. So
yeah, you really like subtlety as a virtue, it seems.
Yes, I don't want anyone to notice that I am there.
Right. So what advice do you have for people who are thinking about getting involved in open source?
Advice for people who are getting involved in open source. I don't know. It's hard. That's hard. It depends on the community that you're joining. I think the best advice that I could give to you or give to someone who wants to get involved is, one, be patient, and two, don't give up. I think it's getting involved at first is very difficult because you might not know exactly what that project needs. So, you say, hey, I want to contribute to Rails. But you don't know you don't know what Rails needs. So you don't know what exactly to contribute, and you will learn that over time. So start out with something small that's like, I don't know, if you can find a bug, fix the bug, or maybe add, update some documentation or something like that. Start out small, and then once you get more and more involved with the project, you can start tackling larger issues. And the other thing is, so I said, be patient. Like if you want to start doing substantial stuff, it's going to take time. So that's why I say be patient.
Well, that seems like a good place to close off. Aaron Patterson, thanks for coming on to Software Engineering Daily. It's been super interesting talking to you about Rails, and as a frequent user of Rails, I'm very grateful for your contributions to the project.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. I had a good time.